You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who fear stock market failure. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers, and we believe in the power of books to help shape informed investors. In this podcast, we speak to great authors about their writings. The late, great Charlie Munger prescribed using multiple mental models and analysis. We analyze their work through the lens of business, markets, and people. We will study a person that wasn't a blue blood or royal by definition, but instead was a commoner that understood power structures and also understood the importance of culture and society. Joining us is Martin Goodman to discuss his book, Herod the Great, Jewish King in a Roman World. A little background on Martin for those of you that don't know him. Mr. Goodman is Emeritus Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies. His numerous books include A History of Judaism, Roman Jerusalem, The Clash of Ancient Civilizations, and Josephus's The Jewish War, a biography. Martin, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome. You're joining us from Oxford, obviously, and we have seemed to make a market in great British authors. So this is very fun, and you're keeping us on point and on theme. We always like to start out by asking this question because obviously you have other titles that are around this subject, or you've obviously done a lot of your work in this arena. What inspired you to write this book particularly about Herod?
Well, the original idea came from the series editors of the Jewish Lives series published by Yale, who've had a lot of biographies of excellent biographies of Jews over about the last 10 years, most of which have been about Jews of the 19th and 20th centuries. And they were looking to do some more ancient people. And Herod is one of those Jews from antiquity. About him, a very great deal is known.
Well, that's good because I'm kind of history. I'm old school guy. Let's start with the historians you draw from, and who were the authors, and what were the texts that you drew from?
So the main narrative about Herod comes from the writer Josephus, who was writing at the end of the 1st century CE, writing about 70 to 100 years after the death of Herod. But he wrote at immense length about the life and the rule of Herod in his Jewish Antiquities, which comprised the whole of the history of the Jews from the beginning, which in Josephus's eyes began with the creation of the world, because he was following the Bible, down to his own day. He had 20 books, of which 2.5 were devoted to Herod. And the reason why he had such a huge amount about Herod was that he had access to a primary source, which was the writings of Herod's court historian, a man called Nicolaus of Damascus, who had himself written at length about Herod and whose work was available to Josephus. So the end result of that is that we have far more knowledge about Herod than about any other Jew from antiquity.
Who was in power in Judea when Herod was born? And can you explain what the Roman involvement was at that time in Judea, upon his birth?
So Herod was born in 73 BCE. And at that time, Judea was under the control of the Hasmonean dynasty. Now, the Hasmoneans were priests who had come to power in Judea a century earlier, just under a century earlier at the revolt of the Maccabees. So they were the family of the Maccabees. And they were ruling over Judea very much in the local style, the style of other kingdoms of the Near East at the time, So they're imitating Hellenistic Greek-style kings like the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids up in Syria. And that dynasty was based around the temple in Jerusalem, where the Hasmoneans were the high priests. But Herod's father, Antipater, was a minister of one of the Hasmonean high priests, Hyrcanus.
And then can you explain where we were at in the Ptolemaic dynasty? I mean, obviously, as our listeners know, you had Alexander the Great, you had his generals, the Ptolemies that followed, and we're not to Cleopatra yet. Can you explain what was going on in the Ptolemaic dynasty at the time?
Yes, the Ptolemies, like the other kingdoms which had followed on after Alexander the Great, were in terminal decline by the time that Herod was born, as a result of the push to the east by Rome. So the Romans, based, of course, in a small city, well, by this stage, a larger city in Italy, had conquered the whole of the Western Mediterranean, more or less, by 200 BCE. It took about another century for them to arrive into Syria. And it's just at the time of Herod's birth that they began to show an interest in the southern Syria and the Levant, the area of Judea. And it was the intervention of the Romans that was causing the decline of these other kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms, but also giving opportunities for small kingdoms like the Hasmoneans to become a local, sort of regional superpowers.
And you kind of tapped at this, but I think you pointed out in your book at the time, Alexandria was a far more impressive and grand city than Rome at that time, for example.
Oh, yes. So Alexandria's had well over 200 years to get really impressive. Lots of wealth that came from Egypt, not least because the Egyptian agriculture was the only irrigation economy in the Mediterranean world. So it's fantastically wealthy. And the Ptolemies were really good at spending it on their one city. So that helped, of course. It was all centralized in one place.
Yeah.
Were client kings a common practice in 80 to 70 BCE? And help our audience understand how these kings were helpful to Rome.
Yes, I mean, at the time when Herod was born, the Romans hadn't yet arrived in Judea, so they weren't yet attempting to influence the politics of Judea and of the Hasmoneans. It's going to happen as he's a child. So during his early teens was the point at which the Romans seriously arrived. And 63 BCE was the point at which Pompey the Great conquered Jerusalem and turned Hyrcanus the high priest into a puppet king, a client king of Rome.
Sure.
The Romans were completely used to ruling through client kings, meaning friendly kings, they called them, allies, who were technically independent, but in practice dependent upon Roman power to retain their power. And their normal practice, and they did this all over their empire, was to recognize one or other member of the existing dynasty who could then rule over that region as a friend of Rome, in effect, on Rome's behalf.
Sure.
So what kind of power does that mean there was at Judea economically and militaristically?
I mean, once the Romans had decided that they were going to intervene, they had a local king or local ruler in the case of Hyrcanus the Hasmonean. He wasn't allowed the title of king after Pompey conquered Jerusalem. A local ruler had economic power. Local politics were under his control. He would have an army, but he couldn't use the army outside his realm without permission from Rome. And so the Romans kept a close eye on any military activities taken by any of their client friends.
What kind of wealth was there? When he's being born, was there vast resources? You kind of commented on the agricultural nature of Egypt. Was there that kind of resources present around the time of his birth, or did those resources come later?
In Judea, the economic resources are nowhere like what you have in Egypt. So Jerusalem is in a very unhelpful place, really, for economic purposes. It's up in the Judean hills, on the edge of the where the desert starts as you go down towards the Rift Valley and towards Jericho and the Dead Sea. The only reason why Jerusalem ever became a major city and the capital of the Hasmonean dynasty, and eventually Herod's capital, was because of its religious importance and the site there of a temple. Otherwise, it's an, as I said, very unhelpful place economically. The agriculture of the region is not particularly wealthy, and it's not on a trade route. It's quite difficult to get at.
Sure. Yeah, because you mentioned some of the crops they did have there, like olives, but these were not vast resources, to your point. The Jewish state, as you put it in your book, was administered, quote, on Hellenistic lines, end quote. Explain what that means. In other words, we can make that assumption that it's non-Jewish in terms of how they're ruling, but can you teach us what you mean by Hellenistic lines?
Yes, Hellenistic is a useful term. It's been around since the 19th century to describe the way in which local cultures in the Near East were combined with Greek political forms. So different from just simply being Greek.
Sure.
And in the case of the Hasmoneans, their central institution in Jerusalem was the temple and the high priest as its ruler. But the high priest as ruler also had an army before the Romans arrived, which he was using. This is Alexander Jannaeus, or in the rabbinic tradition, Yanai, same person. He was using this army for campaigns to conquer the region around Judea. And so by the time that the Romans did arrive in Judea, and Pompey conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, the Hasmonean state had taken control of the coastal regions of Judea, where there were numerous Greek cities, places like Ashkelon, Akko. These were Akko was Ptolemais, was the name of the Greek city there. These were independent Greek cities, which were brought under the control of the Hasmoneans in the early 1st century BC. And the reason they were doing that is that's what you were expected to do if you were a Hellenistic type king, like the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria.
Sure. So Herod's young. He is taken off to Petra with other family members to be protected. Why was Antipater doing that, and what was going on around that time in his life?
So he's very young. He's age 6 in 67 BCE, at the point at which the widow of Alexander Jannaeus, Shalom or Salome, who'd ruled from 76 BC, so she'd been there for 9 years. She died, leaving 2 sons, who then fought for control over Jerusalem. And Herod's father Antipater attached himself to the older son, Hyrcanus, who Shalom wanted to be the new high priest. He was already high priest, wanted to remain as high priest and as ruler of of Judea after her death. This was challenged by Hyrcanus's younger brother, Aristobulus. And there were a whole series of battles over control of Judea. And Antipater sent his young family off with his wife, Kypros, who was herself a Nabatean princess. So that's why they went off to Petra. This is going off to stay with family, somewhere nice and safe. We don't know how often Herod actually went back to Petra, which was an impressive city then, but nowhere like as impressive as it was going to be by the end of Herod's life. The really fine building in Petra was going to happen actually fairly soon after Herod died, just after his death.
So teach us about Herod's grandfather Antipas and his father Antipater. What was their role in the state?
So they came from Idumea, which is the area around Hebron, south of Judea. And they were evidently quite wealthy in Idumea. We don't know quite where their wealth came from, but certainly well connected in Idumea. But Herod's grandfather and then his father both had made their careers in Jerusalem as ministers of the Hasmonean rulers. First Alexander Jannaeus, and then Shalom Sion, and then after that Hyrcanus. And one reason why they could become so influential as ministers of the Hasmoneans was because they were Idumean, because they were not from the Judean aristocracy. They couldn't be a political challenge to the Hasmoneans. They couldn't certainly never expect to have a role in the Jerusalem temple because they were not priests. And the Idumeans were Jews, but they'd only become Jews by conversion a couple of generations earlier, either in the 120s or the 110s BCE.
Yeah, so they were converted under compulsion. Isn't that what you're saying? And explain that, unpack that a little bit more for us. What does it mean to become Jewish by compulsion?
We actually have differing accounts as to quite how they came to be. How they came to be Jewish. In the 120s and the 110s BC, but it's happening at that period as part of the expansion of the Hasmonean states. So the Hasmoneans, in the case of Idumea, incorporated the region into their state as citizens of the state. If we look for a parallel, it's what was happening in Italy in the same kind of period, in the 2nd and early 1st century BCE, with the Roman state incorporating Italians as Roman citizens. So something very similar going on with the incorporation of the Idumeans. The Hasmoneans didn't do it to all the regions that they conquered. They did it when they went south in the southern highlands in Idumea, in the north in Galilee, did the same kind of thing in the late 2nd century BC. The coastal cities, they didn't try to make them become Jews. And it appears that most Idumeans were quite happy to be Jews and to think of themselves as Jews. And certainly in the generations after Herod's death, we have plenty of evidence of Idumeans identifying with the Judeans in Jerusalem and seeing Jerusalem as their mother city.
Hi, I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management and host of this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, I'd like to invite you to check out SmeadCap.com. At our firm, we are stock market investors. We advise investors who fear stock market failure with a discipline that has proven success over long periods of time. Learn more about our funds at SmeadCap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. So how important, to the rise of Herod as a king was the trouble of Rome? Obviously, you had the first triumvirate. You had Pompey, Crassus, and Julius. Julius obviously is killed, as we all know, Et Brute. And then you wake up with the new triumvirate of Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. There was a power struggle. They needed to find a power sharing arrangement, and you couldn't play whack-a-mole in every part of the empire. So how valuable was that power struggle to really give Herod might and attractiveness to the triumvirate around that time?
Herod would never have been king of Judea if there hadn't been the Roman Civil War. He simply, the idea would not have occurred to him. Josephus gives us a nice story of an Essene who saw him as a child and who prophesied that he'd become a king of Judea and go to the bad. And Herod thought it was a joke. It was a joke. I mean, it was extremely unlikely that the Romans would ever choose somebody like him unless there was a crisis. And it's difficult to exaggerate how big the crisis was between 49 and 31 BC, everything leading up to the Battle of Actium. So just a huge amount of military activity all over the Mediterranean world, all just to ensure that individual aristocrats could make their, Roman aristocrats could make their bid to be more powerful than others.
Sure.
And what mattered most to Herod as a result of that was that the Romans ceased to notice the weakness on their eastern border. Crassus in 53 BC had invaded Parthia. Good reason in Roman eyes, which is that he wanted a victory. And for Roman aristocrats, getting a victory is the way you get prestige.
Sure.
Otherwise, no particular reason to invade. The Parthians hadn't done anything wrong and were showing no signs of wanting to do anything in the future to Rome. But it was a revenge attack by the Parthians in 40 BC, which they could do because the Romans were so distracted by fighting each other. And that involved the invasion of northern Syria all the way down to Jerusalem, the capture of Jerusalem, which meant that Jerusalem was no longer under Roman control. And that was the point to which Herod turned up in the Senate in Rome, seeking Roman support, which he needed not least in order to save his family. He'd left all his womenfolk in Masada, where they were holed up, but they weren't going to stay there indefinitely. They needed to be rescued. And he was only in Rome for a week, but within that week, they decided to appoint him as king of Judea in the hope that he could reconquer Jerusalem on behalf of Rome.
Sure, because reading your book, the way you explain it from the account is they say, hey, you're king of Judea, which meant almost absolutely nothing other than you had a royal blessing, I'll call it, from Rome to go out and do whatever you need to do. And they would obviously provide some resources to you, but you had to, it's like a startup business. I'm giving you some capital. I'm giving you some goodwill. Go do something with it. And that's what Herod had to go back to Judea and begin. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. They didn't even give him many resources. So conquering Jerusalem required the intervention of Roman forces under the control of a Roman governor, Sosius. As far as Sosius was concerned, first of all, he had to be persuaded that Jerusalem was worth conquering. And then when he succeeded in conquering it, as far as Sosius was concerned, that was his triumph. And he had a triumph through the streets of Rome in 34 BC to celebrate what he managed to do. So Herod's main job was to make sure that the Roman soldiers didn't do what they would normally do after a great victory at the end of a siege, which is to go wild. And that was standard, that there would be a period usually of about 24 hours.
Plunder.
Plunder. That is an important part of Roman military discipline, that the soldiers remain very disciplined until they've succeeded, and then once they've succeeded, they're allowed off the leash for 24 hours or so, and then they come back under discipline again. Not this time, because it was Herod's new capital, so he would quite like to have it in one piece, more or less.
It reminds me of a sports team winning a major championship or a world title. They're allowed to go crazy for about a week.
Cole, I want to real quick. I want to go back to something Martin said about what the generals wanted was a victory. And I know it's a fiction movie, but in the movie Ben-Hur was chained and he rescued the general who was going to just go kill himself out on a float in the water, and then they came and saved him and said, by the way, we won a great victory. And then all of a sudden he goes back to Rome and he's the top dog again, just like what Martin says, that's all that mattered to these guys was the victory. So Herod fights a battle with Pappus. How divine was his intervention in this problem?
I know Herod was clearly aware that he'd had a difficult life already when he was young. All sorts of things that he'd managed to scrapes that he'd managed to survive through.
Sure.
Unlike his father Antipater, who ended up being poisoned. And then when Herod managed to avoid an unexpected accident, an unanticipated accident, he put it down to divine intervention. So one case was when a dining room collapsed just after he'd been dining there, but he wasn't hurt. And then a rather extraordinary story of him going and having a bath down near Jericho, and then finding a couple of the enemy soldiers fully armed, who sort of just ran away when they saw him. And again, these were put down to divine intervention. Otherwise, how did he manage to survive? And that belief that somehow or other what he was doing was divinely protected seems to have been quite helpful in getting him through all sorts of scrapes for the rest of his life.
The scene I thought of when he's taking a bath, the guys come in. I actually thought of Gone with the Wind, when the Yankee officer comes in and tries to steal money. Here you are, the enemy's in your home, and that was the scene in my mind that I thought of Herod, taking a bath, and the enemy walks in, and they're more worried about getting out of town, and so for some reason, Gone with the Wind came to my mind.
Also, on the divine intervention, there was a pattern. In the Old Testament, where God would deliver the enemies of the Jewish people, and then for a while they'd have a reputation that, hey, we don't want to touch these guys. These guys, God likes them, right? And it's a similar kind of a divine intervention. So he gains control, but weren't most people of power around him legally and militaristically still bribable?
Yes, and in the case of Romans, it's very effective. Having money, or in Herod's case, the expectation of money, because when he was in Rome in 40 BC, he appears to have been there without any cash at all. So it's in the expectation that once he is ruling, he will have sufficient money so he can then pay bribes to all his Roman patrons. And the need to keep his Roman patrons supporting him is constant down to the end of his rule in 4 BC. And one of his problems was that who his Roman patrons should be was not so obvious until the end of the Civil War, because in his part of the world, there were a whole series of different Romans who were in supreme power, from Pompey to Julius Caesar, to Cassius, who'd killed Julius Caesar, to Antony, and eventually to Octavian. And he had to shift allegiance from one to the other without looking as if he was completely untrustworthy. And not an easy thing to do.
Sure. And others appealed to Rome. You talk about Antigonus did as well. He goes to Rome after Herod's king and tries to explain to Rome how bad he is for Rome, to try to become their newest person to support, if you will. That's not successful, though. Is this part of the divine nature of Herod, where Octavian just chooses Herod resolutely, or was there more to it in that they just didn't trust Antigonus at all?
Well, Antigonus had been supported by the Parthians, and so he'd sort of rather burnt his boats, burnt his bridges with any Roman patrons.
Gotcha.
He was also quite well known in Rome, where he'd been also fallen out of favor because of constant trial interference earlier in his career.
I was going to say, Martin, during the book, because I keep on thinking about this divine aspect that we're touching at, which I think is a theme of Herod's life all the way out through his legacy. The other thing, because of the title of the book, I was mentally making a checklist the entire book. I was like, Jewish, not Jewish, Jewish, not Jewish. My next question kind of touches at that. Herod needed a high priest. So you had the prior rulers were not only priests, but they were the leader and ruler of Judea. But so Herod is playing the role of king, but he's not ethnarch. In other words, he is not the religious leader, which is what the high priest has to be. And he goes through a series of high priests. As he goes through all these high priests, I mentally tell myself, not Jewish, because it just seems like it's almost like he's using this role as a way to please his kingship, not as a way to lead the Jewish people spiritually, if that makes sense. Is that a fair assessment?
I think slightly unfair on him.
Okay.
He had a political problem. Which was that the political rulers of Judea had, for the previous more than 100 years, been Hasmoneans. And the main institution of their capital, Jerusalem, was the temple. And so that remained the case. It was the main, all the way through Herod's life, it was the main meeting place for the population in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was by far the most important city within his realm. So he had to rule through the temple. He couldn't himself be high priest because he was not a priest. But what he did was to get perfectly kosher, valid priests. Nobody ever objected to their lineage going back all the way to Aaron. But they came from outside Judea. So he got them from Alexandria, or he got them from Babylonia, originally from Babylonia and later Alexandrian high priests.
So they were all Levites?
Oh yeah. So by Herod's time, it was assumed that those who ran the temple in Jerusalem were not just Levites, but were a particular group within the Levites, the Cohens, or the Kohanim, the priests. And the Levites is another larger element within the tribe of Levi, who also had roles to do in the temple, but at a lesser level. And within the priesthood, any priest technically could be the high priest. They'd been appointed before Herod's time, before the Hasmoneans. They'd been appointed by the Hellenistic kingdoms. They'd been appointed by the Seleucids, and before that by the Ptolemies.
Sure.
The Hasmoneans turned it into a dynastic inheritance within the family. And Herod changed the system. He got, say, perfectly valid priests to do it, but priests who had no local political clout. Do much the same thing to them as the Hasmoneans had done to his family as Idumeans, and that's how they'd come to power in the first place. It was quite effective, but a part of it involved giving a patina of respectability to what these priests were doing, which much the most impressive was the rebuilding of the temple. So Herod's rebuilding of the Temple of Jerusalem was a quite astonishing architectural feat. And although he did lots and lots of other building in his kingdom and indeed outside, none of it is anything like the degree of ambition that was involved in the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. And that must be significant. That was his main identity, was this Jewish identity as a Jewish king.
Yeah, a lot of goodwill was attached to that.
Well, and to follow on that, he only allows priests to build. In other words, you had to come from a priestly background to even build the temple. So he takes what I'll call, a very Jewish view of the building of the temple. It's just not any masons that can go out there. It's got to be priestly people because it is a holy place. Does that just give us a really big picture into the Jewishness of him?
Yes, I know there was a distinction actually. It's a central shrine that only priests could work on, which is a sort of smaller area within the temple, and there we're told that the priests were trained up to be masons and to do the repairs and the rebuilding of it. The major work on the temple site was the building of the temple platform, which is still there, and it's what Al-Aqsa stands on. So this huge courtyard that was created by building out from the side of the hillside, the natural slope of the hill, using arches to provide us support for the vast open courtyard that allowed far more pilgrims to come into the temple and to gather than had been possible previously. And that was using the latest, most up-to-date architectural techniques that were the same as were being used in contemporary Rome in the rebuilding of Rome by Augustus and the creation of a new marble city there as part of the Augustan age.
Sure, but that didn't stop him from building pagan, temples and statues either. In other words, he was in the Greek cities you laid out. He was still out building very Greek or Roman style things in other places out that were more influenced by other culture outside the Jewish state.
Yes, I mean, there are two things, I think. One is that the architectural style was Greek or, in the case of the techniques, often Roman. And the Greek styles were in many cases imitated from Alexandria, either directly or via Rome. But he also, even though he might be doing that for a Jewish reason in the case of the temple in Jerusalem, he also built a whole series of temples, pagan temples, for the worship of Rome and Augustus. And he was doing that very early on after the Battle of Actium. Already in 27 BCE, he turned the city of Samaria into the new city of Sebaste, named after Augustus, with the temple of Roman Augustus on a promontory at the top of the city. And the same thing in Caesarea, which of course also named after Augustus. And the great harbour there had the temple of Roman Augustus just on the top of the hill overlooking the harbour, with a statue of Augustus that could be seen for miles out to sea. So these are very pagan cities. And he made a clear distinction between the areas that under his rule that were pagan, like Caesarea and Sebaste, and the Jewish center of his city, of his realm, which was centered around Jerusalem.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast. You know, we work hard putting together this show, but we work even harder for our investors at Smead Capital Management. At Smead, we believe in disciplined investing, which is why the Smead funds have a proven track record of long-term outperformance. If you're an investor who fears stock market failure like I do and want to invest in wonderful companies to build wealth, we invite you to visit smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated.
Cleopatra and Herod had numerous interactions as they were geographically close. What was their relationship? Was there ever love or just frustration?
We don't know. We're told that when Herod was trying to escape to Rome in 40 BC, having left his family in Masada, he went to Rome via Alexandria, where he got a ship to take him to Italy. And Cleopatra tried to detain him and to give him a job working for her as a general, admired his abilities. He didn't accept because otherwise he would never have got to Rome.
Sure.
The relationship seems to have been quite difficult. And the reasons why it was, once he was in power after 37 BC in Judea, the main reason why it was difficult was indeed the proximity of Judea to Egypt. So Egypt the Ptolemies had once ruled over Judea, and Cleopatra was extremely keen to try to restore the great power of the Ptolemaic dynasty from the past and to persuade her lover, Mark Antony, that it was okay for Rome to allow this to happen. And Antony did accede to some of her requests, not all of them. He didn't allow her to take over Judea. He did allow her to take over the balsam plantations down by En-Gedi, down by the Dead Sea. Sure. And Herod had a unusual solution to the idea of another queen controlling part of his kingdom, which was to lease back the same these balsam plantations from Cleopatra. So in effect, what he was doing was paying her a rent on part of his own kingdom.
A royalty. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, these were very lucrative, the balsam plantations, and they remained so all through antiquity.
Yeah, because, obviously studying Cleopatra, she did use sex as a weapon. And so that's why we kind of threw out the question of love. She had a child with Antony. She had a child with Octavian or Augustus as well. So I didn't know if Herod got in on the fun at some point. But Herod had his own trouble in his own home. He was in love with Miriam. He didn't trust her, but she must have been beautiful because he eventually kills her and laments her death. It seems like almost he reminds me of a gentleman who has lost the love of his life and drinks himself into a cowboy song or something like that for periods of his life and years after. And that wasn't his only trouble in his household. Why he goes as far as he goes to Rome to deal with one of his own domestic disputes with his sons. Why would you go to Caesar to deal with your own household?
Right, so there are two different phases within his domestic problems, and they're really quite different. So his problems with his Hasmonean wife, Mariamne, was that she was Hasmonean. So it was a prestige engagement for Herod in 42 BCE, long before he could have imagined becoming king, when his father Antipater managed to persuade Hyrcanus, the high priest, to engage his granddaughter Mariamne to Antipater's son Herod. It was quite a coup, and Herod evidently thought it was great. He sent away his existing wife Doris and his eldest son Antipater. They were sent away so there wouldn't be any competition for the new marriage. Mariamne must have been terribly young. They only got actually married 5 years later, in 37 BC, during the siege of Jerusalem. That's when the wedding happened. The problem with the marriage to Mariamne was that Mariamne is unlikely to have been asked whether she thought this was a good idea, getting married to Herod, this Idumean who came from nowhere, but also that she might quite reasonably think that as a Hasmonean, she had the right to rule on her own behalf. Her great-grandmother, Shalom Sion, had done exactly that. And the idea of women as powerful political figures was, after all, there was a fine example in the 30s BCE, which was Cleopatra. So it's a perfectly reasonable thing for her to have hoped for, and indeed for all her family to assume that the Romans in due course would look to one of the Hasmonean dynasty to hand over power to, because that's what the Romans normally did.
Sure.
And that seems to be the reason for Herod's suspicion of her. It was a reasonable suspicion. It may even have been justified. It's hard to know. But you're right,
Sure.
that he appears to have had a total breakdown when eventually he put her on trial domestically. So it's within Judea. He put her on trial actually in front of members of his own family, and then found her guilty and had her put to death. And then he had a breakdown. Very different is what happened with Mariamne's sons some 15 years later. So Mariamne died in 29 BCE, and the problem's going to arise with her sons only in the mid-teens BCE. And the reason for that is that these sons were sent by Herod off to Rome to be educated in Rome in the house of the emperor, Augustus. So they were taken into the house. They became very much part of the scene of the Roman court. And in 23 BCE, really very surprisingly, Augustus decided to give Herod the right to appoint his own successor. And this is actually very surprising, because Herod had only come to power as an individual because the Romans needed him. There was no particular reason, no reason at all actually, why his offspring should be any good at ruling. And the idea that it might become a new dynasty seems to have come from Augustus. And this is appears to be a result of the changing nature of the Roman state. Augustus, after all, had won the Civil War, ended the system of competition between Roman aristocrats, which had been the system in the Republic, became sole ruler in his own right, and in precisely the same year, in 23 BCE, seems to have decided that he would announce who his heir would be by adopting an heir who would then take over power after him. Originally his nephew Marcellus, and then so on, a whole series. And it's one of the most remarkable changes in Roman history is that by the time that Augustus died in 14 CE, so he lived a long time, all Romans seem to have taken it for granted that the Roman state would be ruled by an individual emperor who was somebody who was the private heir of the preceding emperor. And this is completely unconstitutional, but totally taken for granted. And he seems to have imposed the same thing upon Herod. In Herod's case, it wasn't terribly helpful, because the two sons who Augustus had in mind for Herod to hand over power to, the two sons of Mariamne, had very good reasons for not liking their father much, because he killed their mother and their uncle and their great-grandfather, and I can't remember which other members of the family. Anyway, he was not likely to be somebody they looked on kindly. And worse than that, they spent their teenage years in Rome, away from him, so they didn't really know him. And when they came back to Judea in 17 BC, they immediately started plotting against him. And it's very difficult that he couldn't deal with them as he had dealt with Mariamne or the Hasmonean opposition in the early years of his reign, precisely because these sons of Mariamne were the choice of the Roman emperor.
Well, Augustus gave Herod that right to grant a successor, but did he actually?
Yeah, because we got the sense reading the book that he's like, hey, you can grant your successor. Kind of. In other words, it was, oh, by the way, you want to retire? We'll see. In other words, he didn't give him much right other than saying it in words, was what I took from your book.
Yes, that seems to be entirely correct. So each time Herod decided what he was going to arrange for after his death, what wills he would produce, he had to go to the emperor and say, is that all right? And so the freedom was no freedom, actually, to appoint his successor. And in Herod's case, it was a disaster because these two sons didn't trust him.
Sure.
He got his eldest son, Antipater, to come back from exile where he had been sent after the marriage to Mariamne. Antipater, unsurprisingly, didn't trust his stepbrothers, who'd been preferred over him all the time Antipater was growing up. He didn't trust his dad, who'd sent his mother away and him away into exile. And the brothers didn't trust each other. I mean, it was a poisoned gift that Augustus gave to him, the idea that he needed to designate an heir. And it poisoned the last decade and a half of Herod's rule.
So Herod tries to marry his sister.
Marry off his sister.
Marry off his sister, but he has one requirement for the suitor. Does this show that he paid lip service to Judaism, or that he looked at it as part of his legacy?
Oh, I think it's more than lip service. I think he just thought it was crucial that males who are going to marry into the family would need to follow what you think of as Judean practices, and that would, in case of males, that would mean they would need to be circumcised. There seems to be less concern about marriages of men within the family to women from outside Judaism. Doesn't seem to have worried anybody at all in antiquity that Herod's mother was a Nabatean Arab. Nobody commented on it, as far as we know. Nor did anybody comment on the maternal background of Herod's sons who eventually did succeed to him. Archelaus and Antipas were the sons of Malthake, who was a Samaritan. But nobody seems to have thought this was a problem. Usually, the maternal line didn't seem to matter in the way that individuals were judged, except in the case of Hasmonean origins, where it seems to have mattered a great deal for these two sons of Mariamne. And the fact that they were her sons is a constant theme that runs through the last years of Herod.
Teach our listeners what we do know and what we don't know about Herod on Jewish customs like keeping the Sabbath, kosher food, etc.
We know that one Roman poet referred to the Sabbath as the day of Herod. We don't know if he has this Herod in mind or one of his successors. But he's certainly, non-Jews seem to have thought of the Sabbath, which was known as a distinctive Jewish practice, as something that was connected to his name. And a joke that was ascribed to the Emperor Augustus, but only in the early 5th century CE, so much, much later, said that it was better to be Herod's pig than his son, which is a sort of good joke.
Well, yeah, one got killed and one didn't get killed.
Yeah, if you're that's funny. If you're a pig, you're safe.
Yeah.
So since you brought that up, how did Herod deal with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and other religious and political groups in Judea?
We hear nothing at all about Sadducees in the time of Herod.
Okay.
Absolutely nothing, which is interesting, actually. The Pharisees were said to have, some of them got themselves into trouble at the time when Herod demanded an oath of loyalty. This was actually quite a common practice in the Roman world in his time. Octavian did much the same thing in Italy when he went to fight against Mark Antony. So Herod demanded an oath of loyalty. The Essenes said they couldn't do it because they didn't take oaths. And Herod apparently said, that's fair enough, you don't need to. The Pharisees said, some of them, we can't do it because we are worried we might break our oath and we don't want to break our oath. And Herod, not unreasonably, thought, well, that's a very good reason for making them take the oath, because the whole idea was it was an oath of loyalty. So they were in serious trouble until a fine was imposed on them that was paid for by members of Herod's own family, women within members within the court, and they're said to have done it because they thought highly of the Pharisees. So that's all we hear about them. Herod, unlike the Hasmoneans, didn't have to take any particular stance in his interpretation of the Torah. So if you've got in this period, the late Second Temple period, there were lots of different groups who were evolving very distinctive ways of understanding the way that the Torah should be lived. And there were particular aspects of that lifestyle that became more important to this period than in others. So, for instance, interests in purity. Physical purity is a metaphor for spiritual purity. Lots of use of ritual baths, that kind of thing, of stoneware for drinking out of, on the grounds that stone is not susceptible to impurity. So these are very widespread customs, and we know that it's the self-designated groups like Pharisees and Sadducees took on distinctive attitudes towards these trends within Judaism, as did the people who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls in just this period. But whereas the Hasmoneans had to decide which of these groups they were going to support or follow, because they had a religious role in the temple, that wasn't the case for Herod. So I think one must think of Herod's Judaism as being much more on a much more basic level, much like the religion of other people in the Roman world, in which the main way to worship was through what went on in the temple. So long as the temple had the sacrifices and the offerings made to God as required in the Bible and the Torah. So there were the offerings for the Sabbaths and the new moons and the festivals. They all happened on time and in the right way. Then that meant that he was doing his job as a Jewish king. And of course, he put a huge amount of effort into making sure that would be the case, trying to make it a really impressive temple where things ran really efficiently. And most of the time, until just before he died, it worked.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast. You know, we work hard putting together this show, but we work even harder for our investors at Smead Capital Management. At Smead, we believe in disciplined investing, which is why the Smead funds have a proven track record of long-term outperformance. If you're an investor who fears stock market failure like I do and want to invest in wonderful companies to build wealth, we invite you to visit smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by UMB Distribution Services, LLC, not affiliated. So Herod was a king of Judea, but you really argue he exerted a lot more control over the Jewish diaspora spread across the region. You know, as you talked about this idea of ethnarch, which came up during your book, didn't he really play that role? He had the leadership of the Jewish diaspora ultimately because of, to your point, the power of the temple and that being the center point of Judaism.
Yes, I mean, he seems to have presented himself that way when he felt like it. So in particular, when he was in Asia Minor, so modern-day Turkey, as he was traveling through there with a Roman patron, Agrippa, the friend of Augustus, he would intervene on behalf of the local Jewish population when they had problems with their Greek fellow citizens in the cities where they were living. And this sort of presentation of himself as a patron of local Jews obviously presents him in a good light in his view. He is also a patron of all sorts of non-Jews. So he gave lots of gifts to Greek cities, and often in the form of new buildings or paving the streets of Antioch or putting up colonnades, or in, most strikingly, becoming the president of the Olympic Games and giving them sufficient funds so that they could last for eternity. That's what he claimed. So his patronage of Jews in the diaspora doesn't seem to have been a formal part of his appointment by Rome. He's a king of a region that was handed over to him, which included central Jewish area and then non-Jewish areas round about. But the Romans were quite happy for him to act as a patron more widely as king of the Jews.
Sure.
So Romans, their tradition with wives and marriage seems very similar to the way the Western world is conducted now. You divorce the last one before you start the new marriage, in Augustus' case. Talk to us a little bit about that.
When also did Herod follow that same rule as a Jewish king, I would argue.
Yes, well, Herod followed. It's not so much the Roman rule as a standard Jewish thing to do at the beginning of his reign. So when he married Mariamne, he sent away Doris. So serial polygamy, as you say quite rightly, that was the standard Roman aristocratic thing to do. But by 7 BCE, there were 9 wives living with him. And this is very unusual in Jewish history. It is completely un-Roman. It is not standard at all in other Hellenistic kingdoms. It was not a practice that was followed by Herod's successors, other members of his family. And indeed, the whole series of stories about the need of Herod's sons they divorced one wife in order to marry another. So Herod seems to be adopted something that was unique to him. And what is puzzling is that we're told by Josephus, who must have got this from Nicolaus of Damascus, but he's a Jewish writer, Josephus, so he was endorsing it, was to say that this was a Jewish custom that Herod had adopted. So it's a bit of a puzzle why he did it. It created a lot of problems because it meant it had a.
Well, I was gonna say,
big
Martin,
love.
if you go through the Old Testament or you go through the Torah and you ask any situation where a man anointed by God, but stupidly takes on multiple wives, the old saying holds true. 2 wives is too many. and to your point, Herod runs into the same pitfalls that Jacob runs into and other, godly men, quote unquote, or, Jewish leaders of the Old Testament do.
Yeah, you're right. It turned out to be a major problem. Though, on the other hand, it also meant that when he had executed 3 sons, there was still plenty left. For him to avoid.
The pig was still winning.
Yeah. How do you end up with 30? Start with 100.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, in fact, let's touch on that. Let's talk.
So Herod dies in 3 BCE. His son Archelaus became his successor. What power did he have, and how much power did Herod's offspring retain in the Roman Empire in the generations forward?
So this is all a part of this strange decision by Augustus to allow Herod to appoint his successors. When eventually Archelaus died, but probably in 4 BC, I think. But when he eventually died, he was on to either his 4th or his 5th will and his decision as to who should be his successor. And they were very young, the 3 sons who to whom he designated to take over power after him. They were completely without experience. They had been in Rome, so they were known to the Romans. And on his death, they went to Rome in order to ask for the will to be upheld. And Archelaus, who became ruler of Judea, had been appointed by Herod as king. But Augustus decided, after actually a very long period of dispute between the brothers, that Archelaus, yes, could rule over Judea, but he couldn't be a king. He would be an ethnarch, which was a ruler of the people. That's the technical meaning of it. But it's a lesser title. And the reason given was that he could only be an ethnarch until he could prove himself good enough to be a king, which for a teenager handed over a fractious population to rule over must have been about as undermining as you could get. And indeed, within 10 years, Archelaus was undermined and was eventually removed from power and sent off into exile in the south of France, which not too bad a place to go. But
sure, even then.
But it's all part of Augustus assuming that this was a new dynasty, that the Herod was creating a new dynasty like Augustus was creating a new dynasty. And so it's an extraordinary fact that for the next century, the descendants of Herod were going to go on being offered roles to rule over different parts of the Near East, often nowhere near Judea, on behalf of Rome. So down in the 50s and 60s CE, there are descendants of Herod who were appointed to rule over Armenia, which is a long way away. And their right to do so was by descent, because they were descended from Herod. They didn't use the name Herod, most of them. Occasionally, it was part of the name they'd been given when they were born. Herod of Chalcis, that was his only name. But the Agrippa I, who the great king of Judea from 41 to 44 CE, who turns up in the Acts of the Apostles with his sister. Agrippa the first was not did not use the name Herod, no, it was not standard. They were presenting themselves instead as Roman citizens, which they were. And one uncertainty, actually, is whether Herod himself was a Roman citizen. Because although we know his father, Antipater, was a Roman citizen, we don't know whether Herod himself inherited that Roman citizenship from his father, or whether his sons and grandsons were given it independently by the emperor.
Awesome. Well, I have to ask this question. I didn't prep you for this, so I apologize if it's scary. I have to ask you about Gaza, because we as studiers of history, we like probabilities, we like history. We think one of the most foolish things ever done in history is a people group trying to cause harm to the Jewish people. I mean, it's just littered with former civilizations that are now gone or much smaller.
It's a bad track record.
It's a bad bet. So I'd love to, you're the historian, you're watching what's playing out in current day, Israel, in Gaza particularly. How do you look at that through the lens of history, I think would be my question.
Through the lens of history is another case of things going terribly, terribly wrong. There were plenty of cases in Herod's time where things went terribly, terribly wrong, and people misjudged as to how they could sort it out. Sure. I don't, for a moment, have a solution to the awful things that are happening in Gaza.
Sure.
Would Herod have had a solution? That's also a tricky question, I think. And if one learns anything from the history of Herod, is the extent to which what happens in the Near East and what happens to the Jews has at all periods been hugely affected by wider events on the wider world.
Sure.
So Herod would never have come to power if there hadn't been a Roman Revolution. He would never have ended up with his terrible reputation for killing his sons if there hadn't been this policy within the new Roman Empire of creating a dynasty. All these things were completely outside his control. And in Jewish history, this has frequently been the case, including the destruction of the temple that Herod had rebuilt, destroyed in 70 CE by the Romans. But again, for reasons largely outside the control of the Jews, but as a result of internal struggles within the Roman Empire. What is happening in the modern world is a product of these wider geopolitical forces, as well as the efforts of those individuals within the region. And that's always been the case.
We agree with you. I'll use Neil Ferguson as an example. He's been talking about this idea. The wider arc of history would argue right now that the West's, its lack of leadership in conflicts, whether we're talking Gaza, whether we're talking Ukraine, et cetera, he argues is it's a problem, to say the least. But to your point, it's showing the wider arc of what's going on at the time, via what's going on in Gaza today. Martin, this is totally great. You're like one of my new antiquity professors that I can come to and consult on the wider lens of history, and thus how it practically affects us today. Where can our listeners follow you going forward? Where are you out there that if they want to keep reading you and keep tracking your writing, that they can?
I operate through books.
Okay, which is a good start. Yeah.
Yes. So, if they want to follow up after Herod, they can go on to the next phase, which is Roman Jerusalem, which is what's going to happen after Herod's death and the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and the continuation of the relationship between Rome and the Jews, and how it went seriously wrong after 70.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about it, but obviously you touched on the eagle, which was a big controversy, and when he died, it continued to brew up. Do you have another title that you're thinking about or working on in the next 2 or 3 years that you could maybe tip your hand on?
I'm retired.
Okay, that's a good response. Well,
good
Martin, we appreciate the opportunity to take a walk, with you through antiquity. Like I mentioned, our listeners need to go buy a copy of Herod the Great. The story of Herod is a story of a hard-fought legacy and the ability to manage multiple power or incentive structures politically, militaristically, familially, and spiritually. It also reminds me to keep your friends close and your enemies even closer, as he did in some cases. If you enjoyed the podcast, go to Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to A Book with Legs. Give us a review. Tell others about the great authors like Martin Goodman that we get to study and experience the world with and through. For our tribe, if you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeadcap.com. That's podcast@smeadcap.com. You can also send us your suggestions on X. Our handle is @SmeadCap. Thank you for joining us for A Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smead Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smead Capital Management and its products at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.